Vincent Donovan, known to the world as Vince, did not look like a man who had just traded a multi-billion-dollar tech empire for a quiet retirement. At 50, his jawline was still sharp, his silver-flecked hair impeccably groomed, and his tailored Italian suit spoke volumes about his success. Yet the deep lines around his eyes spoke of the relentless pursuit that had defined his adult life, a pursuit that had left his penthouse empty and his heart largely untouched by genuine warmth. He was back in Echo Creek, the small tree-lined town where he had once dreamed of escaping, and he had bought himself a monument to that youth, the Old Oak Country Club. Vince stood on the worn, chipped stone steps, gazing up at the club's colonial facade. It was grand but tired, the kind of tired that only money and a lot of it could fix. The paint was peeling, the famous golf course looked patchy, and the majestic ancient oak tree that gave the club its name seemed to be the only thing holding the place together. "Nostalgia is an expensive mistress," he muttered, pulling his leather briefcase tighter. He had bought the club site unseen, relying on photos and his lawyers. His goal was simple: retire from the rat race, inject some life into his childhood haunt, and find peace. He craved the anonymity and slow pace that Echo Creek had always promised, but he had never delivered. A young man in a slightly too big blazer rushed out, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Donovan, welcome. I'm Tim, the assistant groundskeeper. The previous owner's representative is waiting for you inside, along with the manager." Vince nodded curtly. "Lead the way, Tim. I prefer to get straight to business." The interior was a time capsule of faded elegance. Dark wood paneling, dusty chandeliers, and the faint enduring smell of stale cigars and old money. They were led into the club's small, mahogany-lined office. A man in a conservative suit, Mr. Wallace, stood by the window shuffling a thick stack of papers, the final transfer documents. "Mr. Donovan, a pleasure. Wallace Legal, handling the transition for the Harrison estate. Everything is in order, just the final signatures, and the old oak is officially yours," Mr. Wallace said, extending a hand. Vince shook it. "Excellent. I understand the manager is present?" "Ah, yes. She's been absolutely indispensable in keeping things running during the sale. Frankly, without her dedication, this place would have crumbled years ago," Wallace replied, gesturing to a figure who was standing by a bookshelf, seemingly rearranging a row of old trophies. She turned slowly. The air left Vince's lungs. The sound of the papers Mr. Wallace was holding seemed to fade into a muffled buzz. The world narrowed down to the woman standing before him. Time, the brutal sculptor, had softened her, adding wisdom and steel where once there was only youthful fire. Her hair, now a rich chestnut instead of the sun-bleached blonde he remembered, was pulled back severely, emphasizing the clean, elegant lines of her face. She wore a simple, dark dress that spoke of efficiency, not luxury. But those eyes, those wide, almond-shaped eyes were exactly the same, the deep green that had once been the backdrop of every one of his teenage dreams. It was Evelyn Sterling, or, as he had known her, Eve, his high school sweetheart, the girl who had walked out of his life 30 years ago on the last day of summer, leaving behind nothing but a cryptic note and a vacuum in his chest that no amount of success had ever managed to fill. She walked towards them, her stride measured and professional, betraying none of the shock that Vince felt like a physical blow. Her expression was perfectly controlled, a mask of competent neutrality. But as she got closer, Vince caught a flicker in the depth of her eyes, a fleeting shadow of panic, quickly suppressed. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice the low, melodic contralto he hadn't heard in decades. It was the sound of a distant memory made real, and it hit him with the force of a tidal wave. "Welcome to the Old Oak Country Club. I am Evelyn Sterling, the club manager." Vince's lawyer coughed lightly. Mr. Wallace smiled. Vince could only manage a single word, his voice raspy. "Eve." She flinched almost imperceptibly at the use of her nickname, but she immediately regained her composure. "It's Ms. Sterling now, professionally, Mr. Donovan. I believe you have the final documents to sign." He forced his focus back to the present. A million questions screaming inside his head. Why are you here? Why did you leave? And how did you end up managing the broken-down country club I just bought? He signed the papers, his hand surprisingly steady despite the internal tremor. He was no longer just buying a retirement project. He was inheriting a mystery. And the prime suspect, the puzzle piece he'd searched for his entire adult life, was standing right in front of him. Mr. Wallace gathered his things, offering one last piece of information. Ms. Sterling has been the heart and soul of this place for the last 10 years. The late Mr. Harrison relied on her heavily. "I'm sure he did," Vince murmured, his eyes locked on Eve. Once the lawyer was gone, the silence in the mahogany office became thick, weighted with 30 years of unspoken history. Eve was the first to break it. Maintaining her professional fortress. "Now that you are the official owner, Mr. Donovan, I should brief you on the immediate concerns. We have a major charity golf tournament next month, critical for the club's operating budget, and several maintenance issues that require immediate capital." Vince leaned back, placing his hands flat on the desk. This was it. The moment she expected him to fire her, the inevitable conclusion to an impossibly awkward situation. He met her gaze, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, the same smile he used when closing a deal that would crush his competition. "Ms. Sterling," he said, letting her formal address hang in the air, "I bought this club to shake things up, to tear down the old and build something new, but I am told you're indispensable." He stood, walking slowly around the desk until he was only a foot away from her. The scent of her subtle perfume, something clean and faintly floral, ignited a memory of a stolen kiss under the bleachers. "You won't be fired, not yet," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register meant for her ears alone. "But understand this, I will be here every day in this office, watching every single decision you make. You will justify your salary, your competence, and your loyalty to this club, to me." His eyes held hers, conveying a message far beyond professional scrutiny. "I'm going to find out why you left me." He took one final step back, putting the desk between them again, sealing his authority. "Now, Ms. Sterling, start your briefing, and don't leave out a single detail." Eve stood straighter, her controlled facade finally cracking just a fraction, revealing a spark of defiance beneath the professionalism. She hadn't expected the scrutiny nor the intimacy of his threat. "As you wish, Mr. Donovan," she replied, picking up a binder, the silence between them now humming with unspoken tension and the electric charge of a rekindled, complicated past. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in professional torment. Vince had moved into the club's owner's suite, a lavish, if slightly dated, apartment above the main dining hall, making his presence inescapable. His new office was the epicenter of their highly charged interactions. Evelyn, or Ms. Sterling as she strictly insisted, was ruthlessly efficient. She presented budgets with surgical precision, managed the club staff with firm fairness, and anticipated Vince's needs before he voiced them. She was, objectively, the ideal manager. But every interaction was a perfectly calibrated dance of avoidance, her professionalism a shield against the history that crackled between them. Vince used work as his weapon. He demanded meetings over coffee at 7 a.m., review sessions that stretched until 8 p.m., and insisted on accompanying her to vendor presentations. He wasn't doing this to micromanage the club. He was doing it to observe her. He studied the slight tightening around her eyes when he spoke of the past, the rapid beat of the pulse in her throat when their hands accidentally brushed over a blueprint. She was hiding something, and his decades of negotiation experience told him exactly where to push. One crisp afternoon, Vince found himself alone in the main lounge, pretending to review old club minutes. He was, in fact, questioning the veteran bartender, Lou, a man who had been pouring drinks at the Old Oak since Vince was in high school. "Lou, tell me about Eve," Vince asked casually, swirling the ice in his glass. Lou polished a glass, his eyes distant. "Miss Sterling? She's a godsend, Mr. Donovan. This club was sinking. She stepped in, 10 years back, worked miracles, saved a lot of our jobs. And before that?" Lou shrugged. "Came out of nowhere, really. Just showed up and applied for the assistant manager role. Said she was looking for a fresh start. Didn't talk much about where she came from, just worked. Hard." Vince's investigation hit the same dead end every time. Evelyn Sterling had materialized in Echo Creek a decade ago, fully formed, professionally brilliant, and utterly silent about her 20 years in between. There were no public records of her early adult life, no social media presence, nothing but a faint digital ghost. She built a wall around herself, Vince thought. A wall I am going to tear down brick by brick. His focus shifted to the club's history, particularly the late Mr. Harrison, the previous owner. Vince learned that Harrison, a wealthy, eccentric local figure, had been near ruin when he died, largely due to poor investments years prior. He had been surprisingly close to Eve, treating her more like a confidant than an employee. "He left her the club in his will, Mr. Donovan," the club's elderly lawyer had explained. "But the club's debt was so toxic, she couldn't afford to accept it. That's why the estate had to sell it to you. Why would Harrison, a shrewd businessman, give his life's work to an employee who couldn't afford the taxes? Unless he intended for the club to serve a purpose." A major renovation was underway in the manager's office, Vince's office, technically, to replace the worn paneling. He decided to supervise the demolition himself. As a team of contractors began ripping out the century-old wood of the fireplace mantel, Vince saw something glinting deep in the plaster. "Hold up," he commanded. He reached into the dusty recess, pulling out a small, tarnished silver box. It was heavy and cold in his hand, clearly hidden, not simply lost. Vince found a small clasp and pried the box open. Inside, nestled on a bed of decaying velvet, was a silver locket. It was tarnished, shaped like a small oak leaf, the Old Oak Country Club's emblem. His blood ran cold. He knew this locket. He had bought it at a local antique shop the summer they turned 17, a clumsy, heartfelt gift. He had given it to Eve right here, behind the clubhouse, before their first dance. He flipped it over, his heart hammering against his ribs. The back of the locket was engraved. He wiped away the dust to read the tiny, jagged inscription. It was definitely a recent addition, not his high school handwriting. The inscription read, "Text I.O. name." Your future, the word name, was deliberately scratched out, obscured by several overlapping lines. But the message was clear. Someone had been coerced, bought, or warned. This wasn't just a locket I gave her. This was placed here, years later, by someone who knew its significance. He felt a sudden, blinding certainty. This locket was the evidence of the coercion that had ripped his life apart. He cleaned the locket, placed it in his pocket, and called for Eve. She arrived minutes later, looking impeccably cool despite the dust that permeated the air. "You called, Mr. Donovan? Is there an issue with the budget projection for the greens maintenance?" Vince didn't mince words. He reached into his pocket and placed the silver oak leaf locket on the mahogany desk between them. Evelyn Sterling's composure, her armor of 3 decades, shattered. Her pupils dilated, her hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles went white. And for the first time since their reunion, she looked truly terrified. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Behind the paneling. My office." "Your old boss's office," Vince clarified, leaning in. "It's yours, isn't it?" "I know it is. I gave it to you." She swallowed hard, regaining a sliver of control. "It was lost, a long time ago." "Don't insult my intelligence, Eve. It was hidden, and it was clearly inscribed after we were 17. He pointed to the inscription with a steady finger. "Tell me what this means. Who is Name?" Who did you owe a future to? Who forced you to leave that summer?" Eve's face was pale. She looked ready to bolt, but she was trapped. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering a response, her breath trembling. "It has nothing to do with the club, Vince," she finally said, using his first name for the first time, a slip that sounded like a plea. "This is private history. It is irrelevant to your ownership and my performance." "Irrelevant?" Vince laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You abandoned me, crushed me, and vanished. You destroyed my ability to trust, Eve. It determined every choice I made for the last 30 years. And now you're here, trying to hide evidence of a plot in the wall of my office? It is everything." She stared at him, her eyes burning with a desperate mixture of shame and anger. "You think this is a plot? You think I just left you for kicks? My decision saved your life, Vince. It took you out of a situation you didn't even know existed. It was ugly, and it was hard, and it was not about you. It was about protection." She spat out the last word, pushing the desk away slightly. "You don't get to come back here, a billionaire on a vanity project, and dig up the painful choices I made to survive." She grabbed the locket swiftly, tucking it into her palm. "If you have any further questions about my professional competence, please schedule a meeting. Otherwise, I have a club to run." With that, she turned and strode out of the office, leaving Vince standing amidst the dust and the wreckage of their past. Vince looked at the empty space where the locket had rested. He was certain of two things. She had left him under duress, and she was still protecting someone. And the only person she seemed dedicated to protecting, the one who had made her the guardian of this dilapidated club, was the recently deceased owner, Mr. Harrison. Was he the man whose name was scratched out? The man who had manipulated her future and, by extension, Vince's? The intrigue was deepening, turning his quiet retirement into a high-stakes investigation. He would find out what Mr. Harrison's hold on her was, and why the Old Oak Country Club was at the center of their ruined love story. The confrontation over the locket had driven a deeper wedge between Vince and Eve. Their professional interactions became ice-cold, yet more frequent. The annual Echo Creek Charity Golf Classic, the event Eve had described as critical, was looming, and its success required an unholy amount of shared time. The tournament was more than just a fundraiser. It was the life support of the Old Oak. If it failed, Vince would lose a significant portion of his initial investment, and Eve would lose the club she had dedicated a decade to saving. This mutual high-stakes objective forced them into an uneasy truce. Vince watched her work the details. She was a whirlwind of competence, coordinating caterers, managing the intricate seating of teams, charming local sponsors, and solving logistical nightmares before they even fully formed. He found himself not only admiring her professional prowess, but also falling back into the rhythm of their youthful connection. He was the visionary, the man of capital and strategy. She was the executor, the woman of detailed, flawless implementation. They were formidable together. One late evening, the clubhouse was quiet, filled only with the scent of old paper and new beginnings. They were hunched over a massive seating chart for the gala dinner. "The Reynolds table can't be near the Petersons," Eve murmured, running a perfectly manicured finger across the chart. "They had a falling out over a prize horse last year. It'll be a disaster." Vince leaned closer, recognizing the intricate social map of Echo Creek society. "Put the Reynolds near the main speaker podium. A little flattery goes a long way. And seat the Petersons by the main exit. They always leave early anyway." Eve looked up, startled. A genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips, the first he had seen in decades. "That's incredibly cynical, Vince, and absolutely brilliant. 30 years in tech taught me that people are mostly predictable, Eve, and always motivated by status," he replied, a matching smile reaching his eyes. The moment stretched. The shared laughter, the quiet intimacy of the late hour, and the undeniable resonance of their minds working in sync dissolved the professional buffer. For a fleeting second, they weren't the successful, broken magnate and the guarded club manager. They were Vince and Eve, two kids plotting a future they both believed in. She quickly pulled back, clearing her throat. Right, status it is. Now, about the charity auction items. Despite the professional success, Vince continued his covert investigation. Eve's desperate claim that leaving him had been an act of protection haunted him. Who was he being protected from? And why did it revolve around the debt-ridden Harrison estate? He focused on Mr. Harrison's financial records, cross-referencing old club invoices with newspaper archives. He spent hours in the club's dusty archive room, a treasure trove of the club's past. Deep within a stack of brittle, handwritten ledger books from 30 years ago, the year Eve disappeared, he found a shocking irregularity. The club's books contained records of a major unreported cash transaction, a significant sum of money, listed only with the initials JD and the notation, full repayment, silence guaranteed. The date of the transaction was 2 weeks after Eve had left him. Vince's stomach twisted. JD were the initials of his late father, Jonathan Donovan. The piece of the puzzle finally clicked. He remembered the old local scandal, vaguely referenced by a town elder, a financial investment disaster that had rocked Echo Creek's elite 30 years ago. He had always assumed his father, a small-time contractor then, was unaffected. He found the microfiche of the local newspaper mentioned in the plan, scrolling through blurry headlines until he saw the front page from that summer. Financial ruin grips Echo Creek investors. Developer Jonathan Donovan blamed. The article detailed how Vince's father, involved in a high-risk land deal promoted by a local developer, was accused of mismanagement and fraud after the deal collapsed, costing many prominent families their savings. And one of the biggest names mentioned as a nearly ruined investor was Arthur Harrison, the previous owner of the Old Oak. Harrison didn't just know Vince's father, he was one of his victims. Harrison had not only lost a fortune, but he had lost his reputation in the process. Vince gripped the edge of the archive desk. The pieces fit together with brutal clarity. Harrison lost a fortune, blaming Vince's father. 2 weeks after Eve left, Harrison received a large secret cash payment from JD, Jonathan Donovan, with the note, silence guaranteed. Harrison, the man who ruined his father, was the one who bought Eve's silence and forced her to leave Vince, likely using the payment as leverage. But why would his father, who was facing bankruptcy and public shaming, have that kind of cash to give Harrison? And if the scandal was true, why would Eve claim she left him to protect him? Vince gathered the ledgers and the newspaper article. He needed to confront Eve with this explosive evidence. He found her in the kitchen area, going over menu plans. The moment he entered, her professional smile vanished, replaced by a defensive wall. "I found this," Vince said, his voice low and tight, pushing the old ledger and the newspaper clipping in front of her. "Harrison lost everything because of my father. Then, 2 weeks after you left, my father paid him a huge amount to guarantee his silence. Was this the leverage? Did Harrison threaten to destroy my father completely unless you left me? Is that why you said you were protecting me?" Eve didn't look at the evidence. She looked only at Vince, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. The composure she had fought so hard to maintain finally fractured. "It wasn't Harrison's initial threat, Vince," she choked out, her voice trembling. "That wasn't the first thing. And that payment, your father didn't make it to silence Harrison. He made it to save me." Vince stared at her, utterly confused. "Save you? From what?" "From whom?" "From the real person who destroyed your father," she whispered. "The man who set up the deal, framed your dad, and threatened to make sure neither of us had a life if I didn't get out of the way. Harrison was just a pawn in that game, too. He was the one who was forced to make sure I followed the rules." "Who, Eve? Who are you still protecting?" Vince demanded, leaning in, his heart pounding with the terrifying realization that the scandal of his youth was far darker and more complex than he had ever imagined. The air in the club kitchen was thick with decades of suppressed truth. Vince felt a cold dread settle over him. He had always accepted the narrative of a broken heart, The reality of a sinister conspiracy was far more terrifying. "My father paid Harrison to save you?" Vince repeated, trying to process the concept. "From whom, Eve? We need a name." Eve's face crumpled. She finally pulled the locket out of her pocket, holding the small silver oak leaf as if it were the only anchor she had left. "The real developer, the one who cooked the books and scapegoated your dad, wasn't Harrison," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It was Senator Maxwell Reed." Vince's jaw dropped. Maxwell Reed, the powerful, almost mythical figure in state politics, a man who had built his career on the ruins of the Echo Creek financial scandal. Reed had been portrayed as the savior who cleaned up the mess left by irresponsible figures like Donovan. "Reed was a junior partner in that land deal," Eve explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He orchestrated the collapse, framed your father for the mismanagement, and then used the fallout to launch his political career. Harrison knew everything, but Reed threatened to destroy his family if he spoke up. Harrison was a terrified hostage." Vince looked at the locket, at the scraped-out name, and suddenly understood the gravity of the inscription. I.O. Reed. Your future. "Why you, Eve? Why did he need you gone?" Eve took a deep, shuddering breath. "Because I had proof. Not financial proof, but social. The night before the scandal broke, Reed was celebrating at the Old Oak. He got drunk and boasted to me, a teenage waitress who was just trying to earn money for college, about how he'd finally outsmarted his partners. He said his career was about to launch on the back of Donovan's failure." "You had the key," Vince realized, his voice thick with emotion. "You had the testimony that could expose him." "Harrison was forced to be Reed's go-between," Eve continued, tears finally tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Reed knew you and I were serious. He came to me directly, not threatening your father's finances, but your life." Vince stared, horrified. "What are you saying?" "He told me that if I ever breathed a word of what I heard, your father would not only be ruined, but he would arrange an unfortunate accident for you. The loyal, distraught son who couldn't handle the family shame. He had connections, Vince, dangerous ones. He said the only way to protect you, to keep you away from the impending chaos and the dangerous people he associated with, was to cut all ties, disappear, and let the storm pass over you." "And the money from my father?" "Your father knew Reed was dangerous. He knew I had to leave. He took the last of his own savings and gave it to Harrison, asking Harrison to pay for my mother's chemotherapy and my first semester of college, in exchange for my continued silence and my safety far away. It was a heartbreaking gesture. Your father sacrificed his last dollar and his reputation to ensure I kept quiet and stayed alive, so you could grow up safe." Vince sank onto a stool, reeling from the realization. His father hadn't been buying silence for himself. He had been buying Eve's safety and Vince's life. And Eve, in turn, had sacrificed their love to honor that terrible contract. "My God, Eve," he whispered, finally seeing the profound, tragic depth of her loyalty. "You gave up everything." Their conversation was interrupted by Tim, the groundskeeper, holding a small wooden box. "Mr. Donovan, the contractors found this locked box under the floorboards in Mr. Harrison's private lounge. It was sealed with his initials. They said I should give it to you immediately." Vince took the box. It felt heavy with secrets. He and Eve stared at it, knowing it contained the final piece of the puzzle. Using a small key from Harrison's old desk, Vince opened it. Inside lay a single, neatly folded document. Arthur Harrison's True Testament. The document was not a traditional will. It was a confession and a dying wish. Harrison confessed to his part in Reed's scheme, detailing how he was forced to be Reed's eyes and ears in Echo Creek. He wrote that his greatest regret was destroying the lives of Jonathan Donovan and the love between Vince and Eve. Then he wrote about the Old Oak. "I could never truly repay the harm I did, But I know one thing. That club was the safe haven for Vince and Eve. It was where they made their plans. Senator Reed fears the club because its ledger holds proof of a minor money laundering scheme he ran years ago, a scheme Eve and Vince would never look for. I left the club to Eve, knowing she would fight with her last breath to keep it afloat, and I knew that eventually only one man had the resources and the heart to save the old oak from total ruin: Vince Donovan. My last desperate act was to bring them back together. Eve was the keeper of the club, and Vince was the only man who could afford to buy her loyalty back. The old oak is not a retirement project, Vince. It is a trap meant to force you and Eve to find the truth and finally destroy Reed. The realization hit them like a bolt of lightning. Harrison hadn't sold the club to the highest bidder. He had arranged the debt, the sale, and Eve's position to lure Vince back into her orbit and the club's walls. The old oak was a carefully constructed mechanism of destiny, designed to reunite them and provide the evidence needed to expose Senator Reed. "He meant for us to find this," Eve breathed, looking around the dilapidated room. "He built a path for us to finish what he was too afraid to start." Vince looked from the confession to Eve, his eyes no longer full of accusation, but of awe and profound sorrow for the years they had lost. "We have the weapon, Eve," Vince said, picking up the box with the hidden evidence. "The club's ledger is the key to bringing down the man who destroyed my family and stole our future." He took her hand, a gesture that was both a promise and a declaration of war. "We don't just own a club. We own a mission, and we finish it together." The truth, once hidden for 30 years, now stood tangible between them. Arthur Harrison's confession and the small, tarnished locket. Vince held the wooden box containing the letter, and Eve held the locket, their artifacts of pain and sacrifice. The revelation that their separation was a sacrifice, an act of profound hidden love orchestrated to protect Vince from the ruthless Senator Maxwell Reed, shook the foundations of their lives. "The ledger," Eve said, her voice steady now, focused by a new purpose. "Harrison's letter says he hid evidence of a minor money laundering scheme. Reed used the club to process some small, untraceable payments years ago. It's what Reed fears the most: financial crime, not just political slander." Vince's analytical mind immediately took over. "It won't be in the digital records. Harrison would have kept it offline, in the deepest, darkest part of the club's past. The original Old Oak ledger, the one before the digital conversion." They rushed to the dusty archive room. After an hour of frantic searching through stacks of moldy documents and brittle invoices, Eve's fingers brushed against a book tucked high on a shelf, disguised by a worn dust jacket titled 1980 Golf Rules. Inside, the actual title was pressed in gold: The Old Oak Private Registry, 1990-1995. They pulled it down and opened it to the year of the scandal, the year Eve left. They found a series of entries meticulously logged by Harrison in a subtle, almost invisible code. These were not receipts for golf balls or catering. They were small, repeated cash transfers into various shell accounts with the initials MR, is Maxwell Reed, scribbled in the margin. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, but added up to a significant traceable felony. "This is it," Vince whispered, tracing the entries. "Harrison was leaving breadcrumbs, knowing we would eventually find them. He's not here, but he's fighting with us." The urgency of the moment superseded their personal drama. Vince immediately called his most trusted contact, a highly placed investigative journalist in the city who owed Vince a major favor. Within 2 hours, Vince's jet was fueled, and the ledger was digitized, cross-referenced, and prepared for publication. The subsequent confrontation was not a face-to-face showdown, but a silent, digital obliteration. By the next morning, as the sun rose over the Old Oak's newly manicured greens, Senator Maxwell Reed's career imploded. The investigative article detailing the decades-old financial misconduct, backed by undeniable coded ledger entries, hit the news. The scandal was immediate, irreversible, and deadly to his political life. Reed was arrested before noon, not for the past financial fraud, but for obstruction and attempting to influence a witness, a reference to his coercion of Evelyn Sterling 30 years earlier. The mission was complete. The villain was defeated, and the ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest. Vince stood on the veranda, watching the fog lift from the 9th hole. Eve approached him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The charity golf classic was set to begin, and thanks to their efforts, the club was buzzing with life and positive media attention. "He's done," Eve said simply, handing him his mug. "It's over." Vince nodded, taking a long drink. "It's over, and we're still standing. More importantly, we're standing together." He put down his mug and looked into her eyes, no longer seeing a scared teenager or a guarded manager, but the woman he loved, forged in the crucible of tragedy. "I need to know one thing, Eve. That summer, when you left, did you ever stop loving me?" She stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest. "Never. Not a single day. Leaving you was like cutting off a limb. Every achievement I made, every promotion, every quiet night alone, it was tainted with the knowledge that I had to live a half-life to ensure you had a full one. And I chased success to fill a void only you could fill," Vince admitted, his voice raw. "I blamed your disappearance for every failure, every lonely night. But now I know. You didn't leave me. You saved me. And my father, he was a hero, not a fraud, making the ultimate sacrifice to protect us both." He gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the edges of her cheekbones. "I thought I was coming back here to retire alone, to escape the noise. I bought a failing club to fill the silence. Instead, I found you, the single most important unfinished piece of my life." "I became the guardian of this club, Vince," Eve replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I protected this place because it was the last connection to the love we shared, and the only place I knew you might eventually return to." "Well, the club is safe now. The mission is complete," Vince said, his voice dropping to the intimate register she remembered from high school. "The club needs a new vision, and I need a co-pilot for the rest of my life. I don't want a manager, Eve. I want a partner." He didn't ask for a new beginning. He asked for a continuation of the future that had been brutally stolen from them. Eve didn't hesitate. A radiant smile, the one he had dreamed of for 30 years, finally returned. "I'm not leaving again, Vince. We have too much work to do, on the club and on us." Epilogue. Months later, the Old Oak Country Club was completely transformed. Vince's capital and Eve's operational brilliance had restored it to its former glory and beyond. It was rebranded as the Donovan Sterling Country Club, a partnership in name and deed. Vince and Eve stood together, watching the final golfers tee off. They were no longer the scarred survivors of a plot, but the co-owners of their destiny. "You know," Vince mused, slipping his hand into hers, "I've realized something about my retirement. It's the busiest I've ever been, restoring the greens, hiring new staff, and making up for 30 years of lost time." Eve squeezed his hand. "I thought I was running away from you when I came back here. Turns out I was just waiting for the club to bring you home." Vince smiled, his gaze sweeping over the club's grounds, the symbol of their past conflict and their future promise. "I thought I bought a place to die in peace," Vince said, leaning in for a kiss. "I bought a life.